One of the things I was mentioning yesterday, I think, that I recently hosted a series of dinners with public and private mobility officials, and one of the themes that came up in those dinners was the fact that so much of our transportation system was being defined by people with privilege. And this is a theme that came up today as well, too, in the women in transportation discussion about having a gendered lens, making sure that we remember to have everyone included in the system, and that we need to take special care for some of the most disadvantaged people in society. And so with that, we're going to invite Matt Peterson of LACI to have a quick fireside chat here about discussing about how do we make sure that we keep the interests of the most disadvantaged people in mind in designing our transportation systems. Matt, thank you.
All right, and I'm joined by Adrian Martinez of Earth Justice and Lillian Coral, Director of Strategy and Technology for the Knight Foundation. Former colleague of mine in the mayor's office here in Los Angeles, and Adrian's been a long-time advocate for zero-emissions transportation and helping protect low-income, disadvantaged communities. All right, so that last conversation touched on a little bit of how do our mobility solutions get defined and provided, and often we find the ones that are left behind are those in our lower income communities and what are really transportation deserts. So we see all these great, exciting innovations from startups and from corporate innovation here come into the marketplace, yet these neighborhoods, whether it's Watts or Pacoima or Wilmington, still have their needs go unmet. So Lillian, tell us a little bit about the work you're doing with communities across the country to help identify these solutions that the community really need.
So at the Knight Foundation, we actually don't come to this from a mobility standpoint. Our mission, our foundation actually was started by two brothers, John and James, who used to own the Knight Ritter Corporation. And the real focus of the foundation is to foster informed and engaged communities because we feel they're part of a critical and healthy democracy. And so when we were thinking about the things that impact communities, obviously technology is a huge perspective. And when you think about smart cities and technology, mobility is one of the major drivers. And so then we take our lens of informed and engaged, and what we really are seeing is a lot of people, not just low-income people, but definitely low-income people, being left out of the discussion of how technology is impacting their communities. And mobility, as an example, stands to reshape the way cities have been built and designed. It's almost like an opportunity for us to really rethink about how to make cities better. But this time around, unlike the last time around where we were building highways across neighborhoods and really segregating cities, we really want to think about the opportunity to engage people so that it's actually a city and a community that's reflective of the people who live in them. So across the US, what we have decided to do is run a mobility AV initiative that is working in 5 cities, Detroit, Miami, San Jose, Pittsburgh, and Long Beach. And what we wanted to do there is give these communities that are already in the planning process, whether it be with AVs or micromobility or EV pilots, the opportunity to actually rethink engagement. And how do you connect to people of all colors and incomes in your community and actually ask them what the solution is to their mobility challenges. So in Detroit, we're actually looking at connecting the unemployed to employment, and what does mobility look like, and what are these new solutions actually, how do they help the transportation system connect people to employment? In other communities, it's about air quality. In Long Beach, it's about how do we get more solutions that really help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and have more buy-in from the local community so that it also improves their air quality. So we're tackling it really from an engagement perspective, but it's interesting to see how this can really inform industry in terms of design and government in terms of how it thinks about responding to new technology.
Adrian, you've been an advocate for disadvantaged and low-income communities. How are you addressing helping these communities get access to the solutions they need and want?
Yes, so my name is Adrian Martinez, and I'm an attorney for an environmental nonprofit legal organization called Earth Justice. We represent clients on a wide range of matters. I work in what's called the Right to Zero campaign at Earth Justice, and what we are doing is we are pushing a vision in California to get to zero emissions for our transportation and our energy sector and our buildings. And so it's a big, bold vision and under the idea that California, as the 5th biggest economy in the world, can lead the way. Now, I do this through various mechanisms. Sometimes it's litigation, sometimes it's advocacy, and a lot of times I'm representing disadvantaged communities in litigation. So I'm a lawyer, so one of the things that I think is interesting when you work with community groups that are representing the interests of disadvantaged communities that I've learned is one, I've learned never to presume what folks want or don't want. You just really need to have those conversations, ask people. I think a lot of presumptions get made that this won't work or this will work in these communities. The other observation that I think is one of the more frustrating parts of this work is in whiter affluent communities when they're very assertive on transportation and decisions that are made. That's called savvy advocacy. However, when disadvantaged communities or non-white communities are making those same advocacy points, they're viewed as unreasonable or, or kind of marginalized. I think we need to kind of break through that. But there is a couple kind of observations I have from working with a fair number of groups, and I think it's kind of 3 tips, especially around the mobility issues. 1, make it zero emissions. 2, make it affordable. And 2, make it quick. I think this is an appropriate time to be having this discussion in California. The state is literally on fire. There's a lot of air pollution impacts that are harming people. And a lot of these solutions that will clean up climate pollution, but also clean up deadly air pollution, we needed them a decade ago. And so I think if you come to these conversations with communities open to having a dialogue of what will and will not work, I think you're going to see a lot of excitement, a lot of embracing it. And then finally, I want to make a plug. So this conference, I think, is talking a lot about, passenger vehicles and transit buses and things like that. But we also got to think about how goods movement impacts communities. This region has some of the most impacted communities from the delivery of freight. And this is kind of fertile territory for getting to zero emissions. I was very pleased to see an electric UPS truck out front. We'll take 100 more of those coming to downtown LA every day. So anybody from UPS out there, let's get that happening. But I think there's a real desire from the communities that are on the front line of the freight movement industry to get zero emission vehicles. So anybody who's working on that or investing in that, I think that is the place to get going. And the one thing I'll just remind folks, these are communities that have been asking for these zero emission technologies for more than a decade. And they've had a lot of people come around, talk to them. So you might hear some skepticism as new companies come to them to talk. But I think if you are promoting a true zero emission solution, there'll be a lot of excitement.
Thanks, Adrian. And we're trying to take up a couple of your points in our Zero Emissions 2020 roadmap to go further, faster in partnership with Edison and DWP and the mayor and the county and Metro and BMW and our other partners. And it's so important to find how we find those innovations that are going to help us do that, while keeping it affordable and moving towards affordability. Lillian, we're proud, my organization, Lacey, is proud to partner with you on the project and with the city of Long Beach. And how do you, as you've gone around the country and you've thought about these issues and talked to many practitioners and thought leaders and policymakers, how do we really make sure the entrepreneurs actually contribute to mobility needs or technology needs or needs, period, of these communities that we're talking about?
One thing that we've really started to focus on is how do we, as a foundation that sort of sits in this middle space, articulate the value of this input so that it's not, one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that we're not just engaging people for engaging sake or just to check a box, but there's actual true value that can be derived from understanding mobility patterns, which sometimes we still don't understand in many cities, for understanding true need, there's countless stories of just, as Adrian was saying, the assumptions that industry and government makes about the transportation needs of all of their citizens. And nowadays, there's so much data, there's so much communications technology that allows us to understand these things. So one of the things we're trying to figure out is how do we really package this as a way to create sort of value for cities to be able to hand off to entrepreneurs so that you understand the market in a much better way. It's not that these middle and low-income families are not a segment that should be courted. In fact, they're probably the largest segment out there, so we need to understand them. But oftentimes when we're talking about it, it's like in this from this vantage point of like almost like engagement in a community meeting and getting regulatory permissions. And so one of the things we want to do is actually kind of flip that dynamic a bit more, get more information out there, both in the hands of transportation agencies as well as the industry, so that you actually understand the market even more and really understand, you know, the benefit to you as an entrepreneur, but also to the larger transportation system, to the larger city. From the engagement. So that's one thing I would just say. I think we're really solidifying a bit more. The other interesting thing too about all of this work is that there's a lot of missed opportunities. Even with the success of what's out there, there's a lot of space for how you connect new mobility solutions to existing public transit that's not being tapped into. And that's revenue that's being left on the entrepreneurial side on the table, and it's also a gap in the transit system that isn't helping individuals and cities, as we were talking earlier, have more multimodal options. So again, it's not just about understanding the population, but also, I think for entrepreneurs, a way to even capture more of the market. And what it means is you're just going to have to look not just at your slice and your segment of the population, but like at the broader transportation system and how you might be able to really integrate into it more and actually capture a bit more of it more. We see that there's a lot that's kind of left on the table that's not being served. So.
How about you, Adrian? How do we make sure we're actually meeting the needs of the disadvantaged communities that we know that are both get the undue burden and disproportionate burden of pollution in our region, but also then don't get the benefits of many of these solutions we're trying to bring to market?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of models out there, some better, some worse, but I think this notion of just having public meetings, kind of checking the box activities, we need to move beyond that. I think some entities that I've seen in the region are doing a good job. For example, the Port of Long Beach just initiated an EV blueprint process where they're bringing together community, environmental, people in the freight industry, government together to kind of tackle how are we going to get the Port of Long Beach to be 100% zero emissions. And I think that has generated a lot of excitement from folks in Long Beach and in the area. You know, the other thing that I think is important, especially for policymakers out there, it's every decision point where you're investing in a combustion technology, that's an opportunity to start the discussion, start the planning on how are we going to get to zero emissions. And I think you're going to start seeing more and more input from the public that, you know, we need to start this planning to reduce air pollution and address climate pollution yesterday. So if you're doing a contract for natural gas for your city or diesel trucks for you know, the state, these are opportunities to, you know, sometimes we should say don't do that. Often we're saying don't do that. But at a minimum, if you're going to go forward with it, let's start planning on how do we get the infrastructure in place on zero emissions. And so I think this is where there's a great opportunity. I think at LA Metro, there's some unique opportunities around some of our primary freight corridors and rolling up our sleeves and doing what communities have asked for more than a decade is how do we make a true zero emissions corridor? And I think this is the time to start that discussion and roll up our sleeves and do it.
Yeah. 710 being a big opportunity. So final quick question is we got a short panel here. Well, either what keeps you up at night or what gets you excited when you wake up in the morning? Lillian.
Well, I was going to say, one thing we haven't, or the words we haven't really mentioned in this discussion is like equity. And I think obviously it's embedded in the work that Adrian and I are doing, and we're not just explicitly saying. But I think what keeps me up at night is thinking about there's goodwill and good intention on a lot of players, but the reason why I talk about sort of the value proposition is there's no real clarity as to how a lot of this becomes more sustainable, and how we, in cities across the U.S., invest in the infrastructure needed to really get to this, future of not just mobility, but even just smart cities and technology overall. And so it's definitely for the purpose of equity and creating a more equitable future for everyone. But that value proposition, that's sort of what keeps me at night. Like, how do we actually make this sustainable and understand where there are different inflections of value across the continuum? We haven't been able to really realize that in many of the pilots or solutions that have been out there, and I think that that's still sort of the thing that's going to prevent us from making big leaps in cities across the U.S. and the world.
Thank you. Adrian.
What keeps me up at night, we burn just way too much stuff in our city to move our transportation, to generate energy. And what gets me up in the morning is I work with some awesome colleagues at Earth Justice, but also coalition partners who are saying we need zero emissions now and zero excuses why we can't do this.
All right, thank you. Thank you both for the work you do, and thank you both for being on this panel. Let's give them a round of applause.